Oh, good evening. How nice of you to stop by. Come in, have a seat. At this time of day, the cafe has a special atmosphere, quiet, conducive to conversation. Would you like some tea? How are you doing? You know, I often think about how many stories happen in our cafe every day, especially lately. People have become more open, more real. It's as if the usual mask falls off and you can see what is usually hidden deep inside. Watching people, you begin to understand how thin the line is between everyday life and what is truly important. How easily the human soul hides behind habits, deeds, duties, and how interesting it is to observe when this defense suddenly falls. Yesterday, I observed an amazing moment. An elderly woman with her granddaughter. At first glance, an ordinary picture. Two generations separated by time, technology, different understanding of the world. The granddaughter is all in her phone. The grandmother is trying to find common ground. You know, often in such situations, you only see a growing gap between generations. But suddenly something changed. The grandmother began to tell, not moralizing stories. No, she talks about her first love, about how she was afraid to confess to her parents that she broke her mother's favorite vase, about childhood pranks and dreams. And I saw how the energy between them gradually changed. The phone was left, forgotten on the table. Interest appeared in the granddaughter's eyes. It was as if she saw in her grandmother not just an elderly person, but a person with a whole life, full of feelings and experiences so familiar to her. It is curious to observe how in such moments the true nature of the human soul manifests itself. Its need for connection, for understanding, for belonging to something greater than itself. In such moments, you understand each human soul has its own depth, its own secrets. It is interesting to observe how people wear their masks. Someone hides behind eternal business. Someone behind ostentations, confidence. Someone behind a smile. This morning there was a young woman here, a successful lawyer. She often comes to us, always impeccably dressed, always in a hurry. Her mask is constant, efficiency, business. She seems to be afraid to stop. But today, for the first time, she sat not at her usual table by the window, but in the far corner. She ordered tea instead of the usual double espresso, and suddenly she began to tell about how she dreamed of drawing as a child, how she loved spending hours with an album, how gradually this dream dissolved in the flow of right decisions, career goals. You know what is the most interesting thing? When she talked about her childhood dreams, her voice changed. This usual business intonation disappeared, and you could see how behind the mask of a successful lawyer, that little girl with an album still lives. Sometimes I think, what makes people create their masks? Fear of being misunderstood, or fear of understanding yourself. The human soul is an amazing labyrinth. We build walls, come up with the rules, create images, and then we ourselves begin to believe in these images, forgetting who we really are. The other day, I observed an interesting stand. One of our regular visitors, a successful businessman, always in a perfect suit, with the invariable business newspaper, a typical representative of the business world. But once I accidentally saw him feeding pigeons, and you know what was the most amazing thing? Not that he was doing it, but how quickly he hid the bread and returned to his newspaper when he noticed someone's gaze, as if he was caught doing something shameful. But in that short moment, when he was feeding the birds, he was real. Strange, isn't it? We are so afraid to show our true nature that we begin to consider even the simplest manifestations of humanity as weakness. And do you have such masks, roles that we choose for different situations, for work, for family, for friends? Sometimes they grow together with us so much that we ourselves begin to get confused. Where is the mask and where are the real us? You know what I have noticed over the years of observation? Often we put on the strongest masks, not for others, but for ourselves. We are afraid to look inside, to see our true desires, dreams. It is easier to be who is expected of you than to dare to be yourself. And yet, sometimes such moments happen, moments of absolute sincerity, when all masks fall off. I see it here in the cafe, how people gradually thaw, relax, and something real appears through the usual row. This is especially noticeable in moments of loneliness, when a person thinks that no one sees them, how their posture, the gaze changes, how the tension disappears from the face, like an actor who can finally exhale after a long performance. We have such a corner in our cafe, a little in the shade, where people feel protected. I often observe how amazing transformations take place there. A businesswoman takes a battered volume of poetry out of her bag. A serious professor draws something on a napkin. A young businessman secretly plays a children's games on his phone. You know what is the most interesting thing about human nature? No matter how deeply we hide our true essence, it still finds a way to manifest itself in small things, in random gestures, in glances, as if the soul can't pretend to be someone else for a long time. Sometimes people come to me in moments of important decisions, when you need to choose to remain true to your mask or risk being yourself. And in such moments I see how fear and hope fight in their eyes. Fear of change and hope for something real. Last week, one young man sat here almost until closing time. He was twirling an envelope in his hands. It turned out to be an invitation to a dance school. He had dreamed of dancing all his life, but worked in a bank because it was necessary. And now, at 35, he decided to change everything. I saw how his face changed as he spoke, from the usual seriousness to some almost childlike joy when he talked about dancing. After all, maybe our masks are not just protection. Maybe it's a way to hide what we love the most, what we are afraid of losing or spoiling by the touch of reality. Sometimes I notice how people begin to realize their masks. This happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. Recently, a young teacher began to visit us often. Each time an impeccable image a sticked suit, perfect posture, restrained gestures. But one day she came after a particularly difficult day. She sat in her favorite corner, ordered tea, and suddenly she began to talk about her students, about how one boy drew her portrait, not at all sticked, laughing about how children see her real, despite all attempts to keep her distance. And you know what is surprising? While she was talking, her face seemed to be lit from within. In her eyes appeared the very light that she so diligently hides behind a professional mask. She suddenly realized what she considered weakness was actually her main strength. This is the amazing paradox. We put on masks to appear stronger, but true strength is often hidden in our apparent weakness, in the ability to be vulnerable, in the ability to admit your doubts, in the willingness to be just human. We had one regular guest, a successful psychotherapist. He helped people deal with their problems, taught them to accept themselves, and he himself came here late at night sat in the far corner and wrote poetry. He hid them from everyone, considered it a frivolous hobby, but when he read them for the first time, he decided to share. After a few months, there was so much sincere joy in his voice. I often think, why are we so afraid to show what makes us happy? Why do we think that being serious is more important than being real? Sometimes it is useful to ask yourself a simple question: when was the last time you felt truly yourself? Not who you should be, but who you are. Maybe it was alone with your favorite theme, or in a conversation with a loved one, or at a time when no one expected anything specific from you. In such moments, something happens to the soul. It seems to spread its wings, and suddenly it turns out that being yourself is not scary, that behind the mask there is something much more valuable, your true essence. You know, every evening when I stay here alone, I think about the stories that happen at these tables, about the people who come here, maybe just to take off the masks for a moment. And I believe that one day everyone finds the courage to be real. And you? What story do you carry under your mask? And what would change if you died to show the world your true face?